All right, so today we're going to start our next chapter, which is called Cellular Energy. So in this chapter, we learn all about where do our cells' energy come from, how does that energy become transformed, and how does it allow our cells to continue the ongoing processes that they are constantly performing. So I want to start by talking about your cells. Inside your cells, there's a lot of different chemical reactions and processes that are an ongoing process, such as macromolecules being either assembled or broken down, substances being transported across membranes, and genetic instructions being transmitted. So all of these processes and reactions that happen within your cells, they all require energy. And we are going to define energy as the ability to do work. So make sure you get this definition down in your notes. Okay, so energy is the ability to do work. So when we're talking about energy and how energy flows or is transformed from one form to another, we're talking about this area of study called thermodynamics. There are a couple laws of thermodynamics. In this class, we're going to just talk about the first two laws of thermodynamics. The first law is also called the law of conservation of energy, which means energy cannot be created or destroyed. Instead, it's just converted from one form to another. So what that means is that energy can't just be magically created out of thin air, and it also just can't magically disappear either. So it just converted from one type to another type. So for example, energy is stored in food, and then when you ingest that food, it becomes chemical energy and it is stored in the molecules inside your body. And then when your body does some physical motion, any sort of movement, that gets converted to mechanical energy. So for example, let's say you're going to go play soccer and you're going to kick a ball. Well, you need energy, so your chemical energy gets broken down and it gets converted into mechanical energy. Now, the second law of thermodynamics states entropy increases. And so what that means is energy cannot be converted without the loss of usable energy. And so what happens is this lost energy, it's usually converted to thermal energy. And so entropy is just the measure of disorder or unusable energy in a system. So for this slide, make sure you have the definition of entropy. Okay, so entropy, it's the measure of disorder or unusable energy in a system. And so the law of thermodynamics, the second law, says that entropy always increases. Okay, so our disorder always increases. So for example, I have the food chain. So every time something is eaten, so the amount of energy available to the next trophic level, it always decreases. So whatever gets eaten first, that has the most energy, and then through that digestion process, some of that energy is lost. Okay, it transforms to thermal energy. So you never quite get the full amount of energy. All organisms need energy to live. Some make food on their own, while others must obtain it from other organisms. Autotrophs make their own food. So make sure you know this. So autotrophs, they make their own food, and we can break autotrophs down into two further categories. So we can have autotrophs. So these use inorganic substances like H2S or hydrogen sulfide. So think like they use a chemical to create energy. So an example of that would be bacteria. A second type of autotroph is called a photoautotroph. So these convert energy from the sun into chemical energy. And this would be what plants are. Then we have heterotrophs. These need to ingest food to obtain energy, which would be animals like us, right? We don't make our own energy. We have to eat things to give us energy. So we've been talking about all these chemical reactions in our body. All of these reactions that happen in our cells are called metabolism. Okay. So I know you've heard metabolism before, and you've probably heard it in the context of being able to digest food. But metabolism is more than just being able to digest food. So it's all of the chemical reactions in a cell. And when we talk about metabolism, we also talk about metabolic pathways. So these are just a series of chemical reactions in which the product of one reaction is going to be the substrate or what's needed for the next reaction. So it's like a chain reaction where you need the product of one for the very next one. So there are two types of metabolic pathways. The first one is called catabolic. Catabolic pathways, they release energy and they break down large molecules into smaller molecules. And then in my notes here, I have MCs. That's just my way of abbreviating the word molecules since it's kind of long. Our second type of metabolic pathway is called anabolic. Anabolic pathways, these ones use energy, and it's the energy that's released from the catabolic pathways. And these ones are going to build larger molecules from smaller molecules. And the relationship between these two results in the continual flow of energy within an organism. So first I want to talk about anabolic pathways. So when we talk about anabolic pathways, we're talking about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is an anabolic pathway in which light energy from the sun is converted to chemical energy for use by the cell. Autotrophs use light energy, carbon dioxide, and water to form glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen. Okay, so that's our overall reaction of photosynthesis. And then that energy that gets stored in the glucose, it can be transferred to other organisms when molecules are consumed as food. The second type of metabolic pathway we just talked about is a catabolic pathway. So this is cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is a catabolic pathway in which organic molecules are broken down to release energy that can be used by the cell. So oxygen is used to break down the organic molecules, and that results in the production of carbon dioxide and water. So we will talk about cellular respiration more in depth later on in this unit. But if you look here, so this takes place in the mitochondria. Water, carbon dioxide are produced, as well as energy. So heat and something called ATP. So when we look at these catabolic and anabolic reactions, I want you to notice that they are cyclical in nature, which means the products of one reaction are the reactants of another. So if we look at photosynthesis, which is that anabolic pathway, photosynthesis produces oxygen and glucose, but then oxygen and glucose are needed for cellular respiration to happen. Cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide and water, and then the carbon dioxide and water, they are needed for photosynthesis to take place. Okay. So what I mean by cyclical in nature is the reactants of one reaction make the products of a second reaction. Okay. So it just goes around and around in a cycle. So a couple slides ago, when we were looking at cellular respiration, we saw that one of the products is ATP. So I want to start talking about what is ATP? Why is it important? Before we talk about ATP specifically, I just want to talk a little bit more about energy in general. So energy, it can exist in many forms. So we have light energy, we have mechanical energy, so that'd be like movement. thermal energy, which is heat, and then chemical energy, which is energy stored within the bonds of molecules. And so each type of energy, it can be converted to other forms, such as, we already talked about how like we can eat food, and then when we digest that food, it becomes chemical energy, and then when we want to move, and it can become mechanical energy. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about ATP and what ATP is. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So the A is for adenosine, the T is for tri, and the P is for phosphate. Now, that's a lot to say, so we call it ATP for short. And the reason why we care so much about ATP is because it is the most important biological molecule that provides chemical energy. So we'll talk a lot about ATP throughout the unit. First, I just want to start with the structure. So ATP, it's a nucleotide, which means if you think back to our biological molecules, our four main ones are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. These fit into the nucleic acid category, okay, because they're a nucleotide. And they're made up of an adenosine base, and then they have a ribose sugar, and 3 phosphates. Okay, so here's our adenine, the ribose, and then triphosphate. Tri means 3, so we have 1, 2, 3 phosphates. And then ATP, it's called a multi-purpose storehouse of chemical energy. So ATP, it is the most abundant energy carrier in cells, and then it's also found in all types of organisms. So ATP is what holds the energy that our cells need. All right, so then finally, I want to look at ATP's function. Okay. So ATP releases energy when the bond between the second and the third phosphate group is broken. So this bond right here breaks off. When that happens, a second molecule is formed called ADP, so adenine diphosphate. Okay. So this is why it's D. D is for di. Then you get a free phosphate group and energy left over. So this is how cells get their energy. Okay. So when the bond is broken between the second and third phosphate, it gives off an excess of energy, so that's where it comes from. Now, this becomes a cyclical process, though, because when ADP receives energy, we now can bond that free phosphate back together, and that forms ATP again. So ATP and ADP, they can be easily interchanged by either the addition or the removal of this third phosphate group. And then most of the energy reactions in the cell are going to involve ATP and ADP. So what I want you to do now is pause this video, and I want you to take time copying this entire diagram in your notes. Okay. Now you don't have to take a lot of time showing like the adenine structure and the ribose, but you do need to show the 3 phosphates with the bonds, and then H2O, and then show it's cyclical. When that breaks, you get energy, a single phosphate group, and then you only have 2 left in the bond. Okay. So make sure you copy this diagram in your notes so we can talk about it in class tomorrow.